individually articulated notes.
Great, great. In terms of rubato and tempo, it's always something that I wonder about. I mean, do you think, is there indication of within, say, Farewell that you're playing tonight, the Dallin, is there room for tempi flexibility within variations?
Absolutely.
And this whole idea of pulse is one that, I struggle with, I mean, of course, it depends on the piece, whether it's a allemande, obviously, or a dance movement. But even within them, what's your general feeling about tactus and tempo fluctuation of the beat?
I generally think that they were much more flexible with tempo than we have been led to believe. If you read sources like, there's a wonderful source in the mid-16th century, Nicola Vincentino, talking about how to perform vocal music. He says both secular and sacred vocal music, in order to create the right rhetoric in the music, you must be ready to change the tempo from one moment to the next.
Wow.
As well as the dynamics, as well as the articulation, as well as the timbre. And he said those people who perform this music with an unvaried tempo from the beginning to the end are very boring to listen to. So I think their basic attitude was that you find the optimum tempo for each musical gesture.
Wow.
And you can fluctuate the tempo back and forth from one part of a piece to the next. And certainly in Farewell, there are places with very strong dissonances and other places where you have very long flowing melody lines. The places with all the crunchy dissonances need time for the dissonances to speak, and the places where the lines need flow need a slightly faster tempo in order to work. If you try to find one tempo to force the entire 6 minutes into,
right,
there are lots of places that simply don't work.
Right.
And I mean, I feel very strongly about this in music in general, that an awful lot of music making suffers from this modern notion that the way you find a tempo for a piece is to identify the most difficult little moment, find out what speed you can play that moment at, and that is the speed for the entire piece. And often people are happy to play an entire 6-minute piece at a tempo that they don't feel comfortable in playing, but that's what they can do, that one little burst of 30-second notes in bar 77, for instance. And I don't think composers in any period of music ever thought that way. They never thought, I'm going to compose a really boring piece, that it's 6 minutes long, 5 minutes and 55 seconds will be really boring, but it's because of 5 seconds that I want you to really enjoy. I just don't think anybody ever thinks that way. They think, what is a tempo that really works for this part of the piece? You get to the really challenging, difficult moment, and you find a way to stretch and to give yourself elbow room so that moment really sounds convincing.
Right. Would you say, I mean, it seems to me a lot of cadential moments where the texture gets thicker, the information, sometimes even the rhythmic values increase, and so that would seem to me naturally to broaden those. If nothing else, you're coming to the end of a thought, so why wouldn't you take time as opposed to being right on the beat?
Right.
Would you say the same, you just played the those occur so many times, don't they vary from time to time, depending on the passage?
Those also vary depending on their function within the music. If it's the a cadence at the end of a pavan, for instance, then that really wants to have a lot of time to speak. But if it's in the middle of a piece, in a passage which is building up energy, then you really want to be moving forward through that rather than slowing down.
Great. In terms of 16th century ornamentation, where would we look to sort of get a guide of that? I mean, just I know some things, but I'd rather you'd say where could you give us some sort of general guide of if you had a simple line, for instance, where would you look to see how it might have been ornamented?
It depends on which country and what kind of music. But if you had, for instance, a simple Elizabethan tune, an Elizabethan ballad tune, I'm going to play a piece tonight called Grimstock, which has the melody.
Right.
So one thing an Elizabethan lute player would do is to add mordents, both mordents starting with the main note and going below, and inverted mordents that start on the main note and go above, and you go.
Great.
So that already sounds ornamented. The other kind of thing you can do is add diminutions, that is filling in the intervals.
Great.
And then you can do both of those.
And
And
away you go.
Yeah.
And I'm presumably, I mean, what was it that I called you once? I think it was about the famous Fantasia. And you have recorded a version that's completely ornamented. I don't recall
yeah.
So what was the composer's name that re-ornamented?
well, it's from a manuscript.
It's a Dowland Fantasia I'm talking about.
It's a Dowland Fantasia. It's the last piece on the program tonight,
Right,
and
right.
I'm
I
sure
thought
many
you-
of you know it because it starts like that. Very often played on the guitar. It was written around 1590, between 1590 and 1594, in one manuscript from around 1620, which is now called the M.L. Lute Book. It's a manuscript in England. There's an ornament on almost every note. So,
Yeah, it's on one of your recordings. It's crazy.
I included that on the last volume of the Dowland box, which is all the odd pieces that may not be by Dowland, arrangements of his music by other people. I would consider this an arrangement of Dowland by somebody in the late 16 teens, trying to dress up a piece which by that point was nearly 30 years old.
Right.
And everybody knows the piece, so what do? You add more stuff to it.
Right. But theoretically, that would be a good source for one to go to. That's why I want to bring it up to study ornamentation. Look, this is, or would you agree?
Well, it's a
degree?
useful source as long as you realize that the density of ornaments in that manuscript is extreme.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
But it's a very good source also for French music, because a lot of the French music in the early 17th century, Robert Ballard, for instance, was published with no ornaments at all. And it was because they didn't have ornament signs that they could use in France yet. It hadn't been invented. But if you look in the M.L. Lute Book, you'll see a lot of the Ballard courants, for instance, that are published in Ballard's books with the ornaments that would have been played. Because in this manuscript, they knew how to handwrite ornament signs.
Wow.
So it's a fantastic source for French music.
Great. I'm just not to be rude. Oh my God, 5 minutes. Let me ask in terms of you mentioned your program notes, which please, of course you will, class. You will definitely read his program notes.
There will be a test at the end of the concert.
There will. You mentioned the just a final little thing briefly, and then I have two other questions. The ornateness of Bachelard as opposed to Dowland. What do you prescribe this? The different sort of playing. Because they're not that far apart. Is it just two different ones, more of a virtuoso, different personality, or?
I think Dowland's ornamentation is generally more lyrical, and Bachelor's is either more flamboyant or more rhapsodic, depending on the piece.
Right.
But they're two very different musical personalities.
Okay, that's great to hear. And finally, I mean, what do you think the modern guitar? I mean, what could bring to playing Renaissance music? I mean, how do you prefer to hear it? For example, do you think it's advantageous for us to put a capo on the third fret? Do you think we should try to play our scales P and I? What guidelines would you have for us? Us poor people.
No, I've heard lute music played very successfully on the guitar.
And what constitutes that a success for you?
I think it's a question of understanding the style. I do think that a capo on, it doesn't have to be the third fret, it could
Right.
be the second, as if you had a lute in low pitch.
Right.
But certainly, to my ear, sounds more lute-like than without, because that sounds like you're playing on a bass lute, and it just is such a dark color that the music loses some of its lightness and vitality, to
Right.
me.
Yeah.
The question of using PI articulations for runs, I think depends a bit on the guitarist and the guitar. I've heard it done very successfully, and I've heard people struggle to make it work because on very high tension single strings, and if you have quite long nails, it can end up sounding extremely notey.
Yeah.
Whereas one of the characteristics you notice on the lute doesn't sound notey at all. It sounds very fluid and liquid. And so if you can create that kind of effect on the guitar with the PI, that would be great.
Great. I mean, finally, I keep saying finally. When getting back to our beginning of your inspiration of Julian Bream, are guitarists that want to play lute with nails, isn't that sort of a difficult thing to do on many lutes because of the tension? In other words, did Julian Bream's lutes, were they made differently for someone who plays nails?
They were made, Julian said that he didn't want to have to change his technique, so he wanted his lutes to be set up as closely to the way his guitar was set up as possible so that he could go from one to the other easily.
And what does that mean?
It meant thick soundboards, fairly high tension strings, the strings quite high off of the soundboard because he had a saddle on the bridge. Notice on this, the strings are just tied onto the piece of wood and they're quite low to the
right.
And he wanted to have. I mean, this wouldn't work for a guitarist because there's not enough clearance. You would run into the soundboard with your nail constantly.
Nails, yeah. Great.
With this. And he also had a single second course on his lute because he wanted to be able to play rest stroke on the top two strings.
Oh, wow.
Which was never done on the lute. On the lute, we play rest stroke with the thumb, but all the notes with the fingers are played free stroke.
I'm so glad. And finally, just tell us the debut tonight. There's some things you're debuting that I thought the audience might want to know.
Well, they're pretty subtle, but one thing is that in the ongoing quest to try to find the best strings possible, of course, in the 16th century they used sheep gut, and sheep gut sounds great on the lute. It has two real problems.
It's not great for the sheep, but never
It's
mind.
not great for the sheep. The biggest problem is that gut is very hygroscopic, which means it responds to humidity and changes of humidity drastically. So the difference between an empty room, which is dry, and a room full of people all breathing means gut strings go out of tune instantly. So there's an Italian string maker, Mimmo Perufo, who's been working on synthetic gut. And a lot of lute players have moved to using his Nile gut, which is his, I think they might even be polyester strings, that have the same density as gut. And those have become quite popular. He's now started making a new formula. And I have now, for the first time, the new formula, which to me sounds and feels very, very much like gut. I really can hardly tell the difference, except that these strings stay in tune.
So it's sort of a tofu type of, sorry, that guy doesn't eat meat. And what about your strap? You got to talk about the strap.
I have a new strap because one of the first question that people always ask about the lute is, how do you hold this stupid instrument?
Yeah.
I mean, most people do not have the opposite shape of the lute. We don't have concave stomachs. At least I never will. And so the problem is, if you use a normal strap, the instrument moves around like this a lot. And so you tend to use a certain amount of pressure and your arm and tension to hold the instrument. And my good friend Hoppy Smith has played for a long time with a double strap, where he put an extra strap connected to the button here, which he sits on. And there's now a guy in Spain who's making these. So I got one of these new Spanish straps, which it's a little provisional at the moment because the loop doesn't fit on this button. So we used a little bit of fishing line for tonight. But what happens is that I can sit on this, which means I now have hands-free. You know, I could probably do this on the New York State Thruway legally now, because I have my hands-free setup, and it means my right arm is much more free to move around and create more changes of color and so on than I...
Because it normally would tilt, too. I mean, if...
Well, and also I was holding on to it, so it's hard to move and hold at the same time. Now that I don't have to hold...
Right.
But I have never done this before.
So we're very excited.
I started that this afternoon, so we'll see what happens.
Anyway, it kills me to stop, but thank you so much. It's just fantastic.
Oh, pleasure.
Incredible. Great.